We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody, to your favorite podcast. Please give this 5 stars. Again, I don't know what it does for me, but it makes me feel good, and that's what this is all about sometimes. We have a really, really special guest on the podcast today. You're going to be very excited about this one. Well, you already know because you clicked on the podcast, and it had her name on it. So it's Kayleigh McEnany. Kayleigh, thank you so much for being on.
Good to join you, Congressman.
You can just call me Dan, of course.
Okay, Dan. I like to be formal.
So you're the 33rd White House press secretary. There's just not a lot of intro that needs to happen with you, and we're going to go over your background a little bit. But you're the 33rd White House press secretary. But Donald Trump was the 45th president. So what's going on here? This is maybe a bit of a quiz, okay? When was the first White House press secretary as the role is known today?
You know what? I flunked your quiz because I don't know the answer to that. I agree with you. I found it quite curious that, I was the 33rd, he's the 45th president, but I never managed to look it up in my busy mom life.
Understandable. I only looked it up because I saw that, and FDR had the first White House press secretary as we know it. Before that, it was just like kind of random secretaries that and a very limited White House staff. Was like, I think even as recently as Coolidge, they had like 6 staffers in the White House. I can't even imagine that.
I can imagine that. Yeah.
So before that, I'll read a little bit of your bio, even though I think everybody knows it. You served as the National Press Secretary for the Trump campaign, National Spokesperson for the RNC. You got your start interning at the White House Communications Office, and then as an intern on Hannity and Combs, and then a producer for Huckabee and a contributor. You got your bachelor's from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service with a study abroad in Oxford. And, of course, your law degree from Harvard Law School. So we have something in common there. I am basically a Harvard Law graduate myself. I took a half credit in the January course there.
Yeah, so that's a really short course. That's like, what, a month?
Yeah, I'm basically a Harvard lawyer. Okay, we don't need to go into it.
Well, you're better than probably a lot of Harvard lawyers, so I'll take it.
I don't know about that. Did you practice law in between all of these jobs at any point after law school?
I did not. I never wanted to practice. I went to law school with the goal of, learning how to question, learning how to research, really to just kind of take a next step in my career. But I never wanted to practice. I was a summer associate for one summer at Kirkland & Ellis. And after that, I was like, it's time to politics. Great firm, but politics was always my calling in media.
So okay, that's interesting. So that was your thinking all along, because Georgetown's a pretty political school, very policy oriented school. You were already doing internships in politics, and the reason I'm kind of digging into this is because look, people are listening and they might want to follow in your footsteps somehow. They might want to know, like, do you regret getting a JD? Did you like it? I mean, obviously you're very good at preparation and research and argumentation, and we're going to get into that. But and do you think that law degree helped you with that?
Oh yeah, 100%. So you pinpointed it. I went to Georgetown for a reason. It's the only school I wanted to go to because I wanted proximity to the Capitol, where I interned for Congressman Adam Putnam. I had proximity to the White House, where I interned Office of Media Affairs during his final year in office. So that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to go to Oxford for a year. So I did my entire junior year there because exactly what you said, I wanted to learn the art of argumentation and debate. And Oxford kind of lends itself to that because unlike a traditional American school where you write a paper, get a few markings and a grade on the top, you have to read it out loud to a tutor who is otherwise known as, distinguished academic. They call them tutors there rather than professors. And you have to read it out loud and they stop you and they joust with you and question you and ask for your sourcing. And my tutor was a former head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So we obviously had very different views as someone who's a pro-Israel Republican, but those were some of the most formative learning sessions I could ever have for taking to the podium. I can tell you this, the tutorials are a lot tougher as I write in my upcoming book than the White House podium. I will say that.
Really? I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And were you kind of an outspoken conservative at Harvard Law? What was that like?
Yeah, I certainly was. You became targeted. It's really interesting, Dan, because, I mentioned to you the dynamic I had with my PLO tutor. They were great. She challenged me. She questioned me. I didn't change my principles or my views, but I certainly learned from her. I'm certainly better off because she challenged me and I heard her perspective and on life, a smart person who engaged in, very, I would say, civil back and forth. But when I went to Harvard, which was fast forward, 4 or 5 years later, after that experience, the atmosphere on campuses had totally changed. This was in the aftermath of the Michael Brown shooting. Remember, that was the hands up, don't shoot shooting. That was the narrative. It turns out Obama's Justice Department came out after and said, no, that didn't actually happen. We all now know that officer was absolved in that case. But at the time, it was really caustic on campus. I went on the O'Reilly factor and gave a pro-police point. I talked about how students on the campus should not be having exam exemptions. They were asking for exam exemptions so that they could protest, which I thought was totally uncalled for. So, I made my known and was attacked in a pretty hostile way on an anonymous blog. People targeted me for mockery in a school, famous parody they do at Harvard Law School, but it was a member of the Federalist Society and someone I'd go to work with years later in the Trump White House that made sure this parody was killed behind the scenes and made sure that didn't happen because there was a rule on campus never to attack students in the parody. So, I say all that to say, if you gave a conservative viewpoint, you were attacked, not by the administration, but by fellow students. And I think it's regrettable that, at the end of my time in academia, I saw a total and complete tipping point where you just simply can't give your viewpoints and you put yourself for harassment and targeting.
Yeah, that was something I noticed too. I describe the institution of Harvard as a place where it's trying to do the right thing. It's trying to have some credibility and some difference of opinions at the faculty level, but the students are trying to drag it down. So you graduate from Harvard Law. What's next for you? What did you do next? Did you always have your sights set on press secretary?
No. It's interesting. When I interned in the Bush White House, I watched Dana Perino at the podium taking questions and never thinking that I'd be there 10 years later. I kind of moved from the realm of politics to media because I left that internship and took 2 internships at Fox News for Hannity and Combs back when that was the name of the show. And then the Huckabee Show, I worked for 3 years as a producer. So when I went to go to law school, I thought I'd likely go back into media on the other side of things. I got hired by CNN. So I literally was working as a CNN commentator while finishing my last year of law school during a presidential election. So I'd go to Iowa, New Hampshire, everywhere, New York City, sit on the set. Anderson Cooper, I remember looking over my shoulder and he was like, "Are you typing a log, ma'am, on my set?" And I was like, "Yes, I am." And, we jested about it. But, I ended up going back into TV, not knowing or realizing until Donald Trump won that, hey, press secretary is certainly something I would be interested in. So if I had my sights set on it, I would say it was after President Trump became President Trump.
You did. And you were the third of his press secretaries, probably one of the most infamous because, well, let's get into that. Because you were so good. Okay. You were really, really good.
Thank you.
I don't think, I think no matter what anybody thought of the Trump administration, they had to have admitted that you were just a master at your job. I have so many questions about that. Okay. First is the binder, right? This famous binder that you were infamous for carrying around, and you could sort through that thing. It was so well tabbed, it was so well organized, and the arguments were so well anticipated that you could come back with it and come back at somebody's question out of left field and be able to quickly go down point by point. How long did it take you to get to that point? Or were you just ready to go as soon as you took the job on day one?
So I get a lot into this, which I was very excited. You come out of the administration. A lot of people write books. I got to write a book about my time. It's called For Such a Time as This, My Faith Journey Through the White House and Beyond. And I really get into the nuts and bolts of one, my upbringing, but two, what it's like to be in the White House and the making of the binder, like you just mentioned. It was really out of nowhere that I was asked to do a press briefing. It had been 400 days since the press secretary had ever been at the podium. Going back to Sarah Sanders, it had been a while. And President Trump basically out of nowhere said, give a briefing and then do it before Monday. And I had very little time to prepare, not realizing all the way along, I had already done much of the preparation I needed. During the coronavirus, and they had the coronavirus task force briefings. Of course, your listeners remember President Trump there and Dr. Fauci contradicting him and whatnot. For me, that was appointment viewing. So I was on the campaign at the time. I would watch those religiously. I would press pause if a family member came into the room. Everyone had to be silent. I'd take notes. So when I went in, it was a rush to get the binder prepared, but all of that knowledge was in my head. I had two amazing close advisors, Julia Hahn and Chad Gilmartin, who, if I was missing a thought, they had it, before I could even, think to the next topic of the day. So together, it was a work in progress. The first rendition of the binder was like 40 pages, and our comms team put it together. But they quickly realized, for me, I don't want 40 pages. I want 140. And I would footnote, add statistics. I was very involved in each of the topics. But together, we came up with just this perfect product that was nicely tabbed and organized. And reporters used to take pictures over the back with the camera of my tabs and then try to decode them, as CNN used that phrase. So it became pretty funny.
Yeah, and especially with such a combative press corps. They were so combative. I often ask the question, and I've asked this question to Sarah Huckabee Sanders as well. It makes you wonder, should we even have these press conferences? Are they serving the American people in any form or fashion? And now with Biden's president, frankly, I'm glad we do. We got Peter Doocy up there, and but he's like one guy and doing the job of what all of them were doing against you. But it does seem to be a place for a lot of theatrics. And did that frustrate you?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I thought a lot about my relationship with the press before I took the job. And, I thought in a perfect scenario, how this dynamic should work for the betterment of the country is the reporters ask questions on substantive matters. I answer them in a substantive fashion, having aggregated information from all of the secretaries and the various components of the executive branch. And I provide an answer, and it's not a friendly exchange per se. They have to ask probing questions, but a substantive one. I think that's what the American people deserved. But I also knew in my head that the press, of course, treats Republicans differently, that they were not going to allow this dynamic to play out. And so what I had in my mind is a red line. And if they cross the red line of attacking me personally or getting personal with someone in the administration, I would be prepared to provide receipts and challenge some of their headlines and their reporting. So I had that red line in my head. It took, I think, to the second briefing where the red line was crossed. And, that's when I was going to, accountability with the capital A. I put it this way the other day, and I think this is well said. When the press stopped working for the people, I had to hold the press accountable because they were not doing their job. They work for the American people, so too did I. And unfortunately, I don't think they were living up to that expectation of what the American people deserve, which is truthful, factual, and substantive information.
Do you have any? Well, let me phrase it this way. They're all against you, right? Well, not all of them, but a good portion were against you. But did they at least quietly respect you? Is it a game to them? I wonder. This is a question I often have of people on the left. Is it a game to them? Do they know that they're performing in that moment, or is there some kind of professional courtesy or respect towards you at all? You guys having beers afterwards? Probably not. But is there at least some kind of decorum afterwards?
So I'll say this, some people in press and communications in DC choose to have that kind of relationship with reporters where they go to drinks or dinner or whatever. I felt that was not a productive model. So for me, I was absolutely diplomatic and kind as I would be to anyone in my life. And yes, there were amazing reporters. Some of them that they were the ones you don't often hear from. You probably don't know their names because they're serious reporters who just wanted to ask questions. They're not into, as you've noted, the performative arts. So we would absolutely have a decorum or respect when we would cross paths on Air Force One or wherever. But there were some reporters, and Jen Acosta, Caitlin Collins, where I would say Maggie Haberman, where it is about their brand, unfortunately. And, Jim Acosta always found a way to make it about him. And I think that those reporters that find a way to make it about them, I think their motives speak for themselves.
Yeah. I mean, as Ben Shapiro says, nobody loves him some Jim Acosta like Jim Acosta loves him some Jim Acosta.
Exactly.
He does. He loves himself, and he's always kind of playing this sort of like heroic victim card. And it's such a weird card. I remember at the beginning of the administration, well, I wouldn't say the beginning. I would say when I entered politics in 2018. I remember being in this interview on MSNBC with like 3 other Democrat freshmen. This was back when these channels actually invited me on a lot more. They sort of stopped after a while because they realized how good it was for me. And and interestingly enough, they just get bashed when they have us on because they don't like to platform us, or the left doesn't like us being platformed. We should get into that. It's an interesting take. But the point was they kept bringing up the attacks on the press from the Trump administration. And I was like, I've been attacked. And this is not attacking, right? Like disagreeing with you guys, calling you out is not attacking you. You're not under threat. Yeah. A funny meme of CNN getting hit by a train. It's just funny. Like it's not real, guys. Yeah. Like can we stop with the hyperbole?
They're very sensitive.
They are, and they're so high and mighty about it. I mean, and now you're like full on in media, and so this kind of gets the other point I was making, which is, on Fox, and conservatives in general love to see debates. Like we love to see somebody debate Ben Shapiro, right? That makes us happy. But I forget her name, but she just debated Ben Shapiro in front of a large crowd, and she got hammered for it by the left. Chuck Todd got hammered for having so many Republicans on by the left because because recently he dared to criticize the Biden administration. It's fascinating how brittle they are, how afraid they are of different opinions. I mean, what do you think causes? I mean, you're in it more than I am. What do you think causes that?
True. I mean, look, I worked at CNN in 2015 and part of 2016. And they did give a platform to me as a conservative who supported President Trump. They did give a platform to Jeffrey Lord, to Paris Denard, to a few others. Yes, it was a 1-on-8, sometimes 2-on-7 platform where they'd have these massive panels and then I'd be the only Trump supporter. So it wasn't balanced, but at least there was someone, squeaking on the side about this other point of view. But then they just made a very clear decision. And I'm speaking just of CNN here, but it's really a lot. It's more than just CNN. It's the leftist press. They made a decision after Trump won. There was no room for an alternate viewpoint. It's almost like they went into full on, we are going to be an apparatus of the DNC mode. Now you have the press, which is mildly critical of Biden on Afghanistan. You're starting to see some criticism or some questions being asked, not enough, but it's as if President Trump wins and then they went into full-on mission as a counterpart to the DNC to take him down. And that meant no alternative views. That meant getting rid of anyone who thought differently, which is why even on CNN today, can you name one person who supports President Trump? Maybe there's one, but it doesn't come to my mind. I also don't watch CNN often, so.
No, and it's what's a problem with the press too is the kind of the fake objectivity that they adhere to. Look, I mean, we all know what Fox stands for. We all know what MSNBC stands for. Like I'm not even talking about the Rachel Maddows of the world when we talk about press bias. America has always had political press. That's always been part of our DNA. There was kind of a time period where it was watered down quite a bit, but we went right back into it. What's frustrating is the ones who feign this objectivity, like the New York Times and CNN, and don't call yourself a journalist or a news anchor. Just call yourself an opinion contributor, and then everything could be fine. Yeah,
I got hammered for saying that from the podium. When I say hammered by the leftist journalists. Caitlin Collins, I forget what prompted me to do this, but she had asked some particularly out of line questions. And so the next briefing, I decided to skip her, and she was screaming as I walked out. And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't call an activist." And she was very upset by that. Why would you call me an activist? Well, I'm sorry, but that's what a lot of you are. And certainly those trying to garner headlines and not ask real probing questions. Like Jim Acosta, maybe he went to others in the press shop, but unlike some reporters who would come to me with an emailed question and say, hey, do I have this right before I publish my story? And sometimes they'd still run with the false headline. But he's one that he didn't even come to me, or he didn't even email me to see if his story was correct. If he was reaching out to other people and my team, maybe that's the case. But it's those journalists where it's all about when the cameras turn on, less so about doing the behind the scenes reporter work that may not be as glamorous, may not allow you to sell a book, but is nonetheless important.
You had a kind of a reputation where, there's T-shirts made of your face where you're like looking at the reporters and you're like, next question. It's like this, like, next stupid question, please.
Facts,
it's a very happy warrior. And you give us all some advice here. How do you maintain that attitude, that outlook? How do you maintain your cool and your tone? And it's so important to do that because it's also how you persuade people. It's one thing to own the libs. It's another thing to own the libs with purpose and with conviction and with some sense of persuasion that wins the arguments.
Yeah. So I think, look, number one, I told you I interned for Hannity and Combs. Someone who gave me great advice was Alan Combs. I love Sean, of course, but the late Alan Combs, he was on the left. We disagreed on everything, but he was somewhat of a mentor to me. And when I went to CNN, and he watched me on one of the panels, the 8-on-1 panels I mentioned, and I'll never forget, he sent me a message after, and he said, Kayleigh, remember, don't fight fire with fire, fight fire with water. And what he said was so wise. If I rage at Christine Quinn, who was someone who I had a viral moment with her because I kept my cool. As she was getting angry, I was there smiling and I was there keeping my calm, and it ended up going viral. And the reason that was such an effective clip was because I brought water to the fire, not fire to compete with the fire. And I thought that was good advice. But beyond that, I think having grace and realizing, as Ravi Zacharias so wisely put it, behind every question is a questioner who has hurts and reasons for the way they're acting. And when you see the questioner as a person, it helps you to say, this isn't about, viral Twitter moments. Certainly there were some of those just naturally, but this is, I want to have grace and treat this person with respect. So I think those two things combined make you effective at the job, because if you just go up there and shout at people, it normally doesn't work well. And you're right, you don't persuade a lot of people.
It doesn't work well. And it's something I remind our side of a lot, that the entire point of politics is actually, well, it's not the entire point, but a big point of it is persuasion. Well, and I would say this, the only way to win is persuasion, because our side's always saying, you got to go out and fight, go fight, fight, fight. And somebody will go out and yell and scream and repeat the kind of red meat slogans that we hear all the time. And they'll see, that's a fighter. And I'll say, I'm not so sure they're fighting for you. They're clearly fighting for their clicks or their fundraising or whatever it might be, or their views. But who did they persuade today? Like, who did they win an argument today? And you just want arguments. You just want arguments all day long on that job.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting, but I bet it's satisfying. And again, looking for some advice for the audience. How do you think about framing arguments? How do you think about approaching persuasive techniques and approaching these debates? Because it really was just a full-on debate, often at all times with you, and you came out on top. And it sounds like your experience at Harvard Law helped you a lot with that, and just how to think critically about and using the right facts and reasoning to arrive at a conclusion.
Yeah, I think for me, it's it's funny, when I first got the binder, and we had a great communications team, but they adapt every secretary style. So just like I had to adapt to how President Trump prepped for a briefing, and I had to figure out, how can I break through to him? What's the way he consumes information? Is it listening? Is it reading? What is it? The same way I had to adapt to him, the communications team had to adapt to me. So when they first gave me the binder, it was very top line, almost like maybe talking points that you would get from the RNC. I know sometimes they'll send out talking points to their surrogates, but very top line. And I used to work at the RNC, so I saw that, and there's a place for top line talking points. But I come from such a research oriented background. I wanted the top line, but underneath it, several dented in bullet points substantiating the top line. And the communications team was brilliant, led by Julia Hahn. And Julia Hahn quickly, she's smart as a whip, one of the smartest people I've ever met in Washington, or really ever. She quickly learned that's what I liked. So for me, it was all about the footnotes. Do we have a JAMA pediatric study to back up why kids should be in schools? Do we have a quote from a source or an authority that we trust? where do we have an academic journal article that has a statistic that backs up the point we're trying to make on COVID-19 therapeutics? And, so it was very wonky, really, the way the binder would look. But one of the big challenges in the White House is you are the primary source for a lot of the information. So I could go aggregate studies from academics or point, information to back up what I was saying that went a long way with reporters. But when you're at the White House, you're the primary source. So you're having to call the head of the CDC, the head of HHS and or FDA, Dr. Hahn, and you're getting information that comes in and it doesn't always match. And sometimes it's about a meeting that you're not in. So you have to discern when you have, many streams of information coming in, what is the most accurate thing I can bring to the podium that I know to be certain and know to be true. So you almost have to learn how to question the person giving you the information. And you have to learn if they back off what they're telling you, okay, that's probably, I'm not going to use that information. If they double down and can provide backup, you can bring it forward. So I say all this to say sourcing and a plethora of information to back up the top line. So you're not just saying, we have COVID-19 effectiveness in our response. You're saying I brought therapeutics, and you can name them dexamethasone, right, and have the facts to back it up.
Yeah, it's important. That's also how I ask my staff to prep me also, because you need the top line, right? You need to frame the argument first of all, and then boom, if you just have like 3 facts that back it up, it's extremely effective. And it almost surprises me how little so many people do that, because it seems so obvious.
And also questioning, let me just say, questioning the questioner. So many times I would say, Jen Acosta, was that really the quote? Do you have the transcript there? Oh, no, I don't have it. Oh, so you can't read it. So putting the questioner on defense too helps a lot. Yeah.
Well, you write about that in your book. And you talk about this strategy of going on offense. So what does that mean to you? How did you communicate that to the team?
Yeah. So my dad, I was pretty nervous about taking the job, and I had never led a team before. I had worked for organizations, but never had, a team underneath me. And so I said to my dad, what can I do to be effective? And he, my dad's a business owner, built it from the ground up. He handwrote quotes about leadership and pieces of advice. And one of them was, come up with a motto for your press shop. And I thought a lot about it. And I said, our motto needs to be offense only. And offense only meant a few things. It meant highlighting stories the press was never going to cover, but deserved to be covered, like David Dorn, the officer who was killed tragically in a riot. Some of these beautiful children who have died in the streets of mostly Democrat cities, like Sequoia Turner in Atlanta or Legend Taliaferro, these kids who are victims of, horrific crime, and their stories often go unreported on a national level. So it meant bringing to light the forgotten men and women and children that President Trump mentioned and bringing their stories to life from the podium. But it also meant accountability. It meant that I wasn't going to be a press secretary who was shouted down by Jim Acosta, and I would be a press secretary that would respond and go on offense. And that meant bringing their headlines to them that they like to forget, they don't correct, they're lazy enough to let go, or they intentionally leave up falsehoods. It meant bringing their headlines to the podium and challenging them in a way that was offensive. Or in the case of Nancy Pelosi and her hypocrisy, when we played the video on loop of her at the salon, I don't know if you remember that one. We literally played it on loop so people could see the Democrat hypocrisy, not just hear about it in cable news segments.
Yeah, and that's true, because they have to cover what you're doing as the White House press secretary, because the vast swaths of America, they're not watching Fox. It's so important for us to get out on these other platforms, and it's difficult because Americans kind of by nature silo themselves into their own bubble. Liberals aren't following me just out of curiosity. It's just not how it works. And I'm sure you saw this at Harvard too. It's amazing. They really don't know what we think. We tend to know what they think. And this is true. This is true in a lot of interesting survey data too. Like if you go to actually yourmorals.org, with Jonathan Haidt runs this thing. I often reference him, and they do this survey where they ask conservatives, okay, how would a liberal ask this question or answer this question? And they ask liberals, how would a conservative answer this question? And you see who gets it right. And as it turns out, moderates pretty much get both sides right. Conservatives pretty much get it right, and liberals just don't get it right. I mean, the far left.
They're never challenged. I mean, first of all, that's a fascinating concept. but they're never challenged. I always say I was advantaged to be one of the few conservatives on campus because I got to see how liberals think. I got to, see the playbook. But I mean, if you're a liberal, think about it, who went to a college campus and only watches mainstream press, you've never heard any other side. So I'm not surprised. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and even the professors, they'll think that it's not even in debate. Like they think that maybe I'll agree with something. One of those fascinating conversations I remember was professor comes up to me. This is actually after I was elected and I was going back for the orientation thing. And they're like, look, you should be in favor of this carbon dividend, right? It's not really a carbon tax. I mean, it is, but we take the money and we put it through this government bureaucracy and then we give it back to people. It's a dividend. And the government doesn't make any money off of it. So that's why conservatives like it, right? And I'm like, you have no idea what our philosophy is. I don't care
right.
if the government makes more money. After the Trump tax cuts, the government made more money, as it turns out, okay? So it's not the fact that if you increase the tax base that frustrates me. It's the fact that you're running it through a whole different bureaucracy just to give it right back to people. So you're taxing people just to give them money back. This is just inefficient. It's bad governance. It's a small example, but it just goes to show they just don't understand where we're coming from, a conservative philosophy. I think part of that's our fault. Over the last couple of decades, I think we got too comfortable after the Reagan era and forgot that there was a vast movement out there that fundamentally disagrees with the nature of our founding, with the nature of our country, with limited government, with all of it. They fundamental disagreements, both in culture and in politics and in economics, and we kind of forgot how to defend ourselves. It's kind of why I'm so obsessive about asking you about how you argue and how you prepare, because I think it's so important for conservatives. One question I wanted to ask you, do you have a most memorable moment as White House press secretary that you would share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot, I think, and I wrote a whole chapter of this in my book, but I think definitely one of the most memorable moments was when President Trump got COVID-19. I mean, I get often asked, what was your best and your worst time in the White House? And, best obviously was, well, not obviously, but for me, it was definitely the day I gave my first press briefing. But worst was definitely when he contracted, this novel illness that had really consumed all of American life, all of the world last year. It was eerie. It was jarring. I actually found out he got COVID-19 when I was sitting in my apartment watching him live on Hannity. I didn't know if I was finding out that he was COVID positive before he actually found out, as he's talking on live television. We waited for the second confirmatory test, the PCR test, and came back positive. And I helped him draft the tweet to put out that he was COVID positive. But, I went back into the White House the next day and the halls were essentially empty. And I wondered, were we not supposed to show up today? What's going on here? It was me, the chief of staff, Jared, my press shop, and that day, I wasn't communicating with the president. He was someone who communicated with me often as his press secretary. But that day, he was up in the residence. And it was a jarring moment to watch him go to Walter Reed, not to know his status, at least not to be able to see him so I could confirm it with my eyes. So it was scary. It was scary to have a Oval Office without a president in it. But I guess that's the new norm in the Biden administration. So.
Yeah, that's true. Now that was a scary moment. We were glad to see he bounced back rather quickly. And we were happy to see that. I could see that moment being frustrating. I mean, what about some of the just like there's so many of these. One that comes to mind was let me find it. The example I'm thinking of, the bunker story, the anonymous sources from the Atlantic who made unsubstantiated claims about Trump's view of service members. You remember what I'm talking about there.
Oh, yeah, I could never forget that. Yeah.
And I don't forget it either because I got yelled at by some of my Democrat colleagues. They're like, we've had it. My dad's a veteran. And how could you ever stand with a man who said these things? And my first question was like, how do you know he said these things? I mean, these are anonymous sources. I mean, have you not been persuaded yet that maybe sometimes this stuff isn't real? I mean, this sort of hearsay stuff. So how do you combat that as a press secretary? Because this was time after time, these anonymous sources.
So let me say, first of all, it was infuriating, especially now as I look back, just to briefly run through a few, and I definitely want to address that story. But, we were told that Trump gassed protesters to take a picture at the front of Lafayette Church.
Yep,
that ended up being false. We found that out from the Inspector General. Then we were told by an anonymous source, as you say, that there were Russian bounties on the heads of troops in Afghanistan. And the New York Times had done this sick and twisted next step of convincing families, Gold Star parents that lost their children, that their children might have died because President Trump did nothing. And I told them this was a lie. I told them it was not true. Now we know it's not true. The Daily Beast of all folks have debunked it, and the intel community under Biden. But I mean, imagine the pain of a Gold Star family thinking you had a commander in chief that just didn't care, didn't lift a finger or do anything. And again, debunked in hindsight. The Hunter Biden allegations now look quite credible. The ones that folks were banned off social media for posting, like the New York Post and myself. So I say all this to say there's been so much vindication, and so much 10 months later, we find out something was or was not true, the COVID lab leak theory. But when you're in the moment, it is immensely frustrating. And you put your finger on the most frustrating story, I think, during our time, which was the fact that, not the fact, but the story, the fact that there was a story that President Trump had used disparaging terms about our fallen military men and women. He had called them, they said, suckers and losers was the words. I remember when the story popped, President was on the stage at a rally, forget exactly where we were. He comes off and I have to tell him about this story, whisper in his ear before he heads to the plane. He gets on the plane. I had to tell him in case he came in contact with reporters before he went on the flight. On the plane, I'd never seen him more discouraged. I'd never seen him more upset. He's someone who I'd come to him with a New York Times tax story and about his taxes, and another hit piece, he would just be pretty dismissive over it. This one got to him. He kept saying over and over again, what kind of monster would say these things? What kind of monster? Because he never said them. And, using offense only, which was the motto for my press shop, I said, how can we combat this? And, I said, let's go get everyone who was there on this trip to France on the record in a story. And so I think we ended up getting nearly 24 people to go on the record and say this simply didn't happen. So it was an anonymous source versus more than 20 on the record. So I think people see it for the lie it was, but it's very frustrating when you're in the moment dealing with a story like that.
Yeah, and it's just frustrating after, too, because even when you debunk all of these things, and it's vindicating to us, but the truth is a lot of people still read the story. It's not like there's a next story on the front headlines that says it was debunked, right? That it's not how they do things at the Atlantic or the New York Times. Anywhere, people believe these things. Look, and I tell our own side the same things. Stop believing everything you see. You got to question it, and you got to question all of it. I mean, there's weird conspiracies about me, right, running around on the right, and it's
me too.
Yeah. And it's frustrating. All right, here's a fun question. If Jen Sackey was your friend, what advice would you give her after watching her for the last, 10 months?
Oh gosh. I would say, and look, I did meet Jen once at CNN. She was very nice to me. We had a nice conversation. This was long before either of us were in our roles. But one thing I would say is, I went to really great lengths. There were times that we brought in David Jones and Scott Gass, counsel at the White House to come in and say, hey, am I okay to say this from the podium? Because there's the Hatch Act and you shouldn't say something that's advocating for a political party. So we would go to great pains and get things vetted before we'd say them. But twice she's gone to the podium, advocated blatantly for a political candidate. And I think, it caused me to ask, is her staff around her not telling her this thing exists and she shouldn't do it, or does she just not care? But, I think it's important. I'm also the kid who, back in middle school when my friend got caught with a snack in the hallway and went to detention, I had to tell on myself that I had a snack in the hallway too when I went to detention with her. So I'm also someone who crosses every T, dots every I. And people laugh at the Hatch Act, but I cared about it, which is why I separated my role on the campaign. I do campaign hits from the campaign, my unofficial role in my White House role, a situation that was approved by the ethics attorneys. But that would be my one piece of advice. It may be boring and technical, but.
Yeah. What about style? Any style advice? Not like her hair. That's not what I mean. I mean, in the ways she presents.
No. one thing that she does well, and it's a tactic I use too, I would say, and she deploys it effectively, is she'll question the questioner. She does that a lot. You'll see her do that with reporters to take the heat off her and put them on their toes. So I think that's pretty effective. But I'd say, my personal style, as I said, is I cite academic journal articles and numbers and stats. And, I think that'd be good to weave that into, what you're doing from the podium. But hey, everyone has their own style.
Well, one thing you write about in your own story is when you went to Harvard Law, you also had possibly the option of going on The View as a full-time host. Can you tell us about that? Is there any chance that you will be the replacement for Meghan McCain? Is there still any chance of that? Because that'd be pretty cool.
The answer to that is no. But no, it is funny looking back. There was a brief time right before I went to law school, and they were looking for a conservative on The View. And I was asked, I appeared on the show, it aired. I was brought back for a chemistry test, and that's where they bring back like a handful of hosts and try you out behind the scenes to see your chemistry. So I was brought back for that, didn't end up getting the job. But it was funny at the time, Rosie O'Donnell was on the show, and I remember telling her I had just gotten into Harvard Law School, and I remember she was very nice to me, by the way. I think now she's blocked me for some reason. I've not attacked Rosie, so I don't know why she would have done that. But she was very nice to me at the time and said, hey, you need to go to law school. Like, why are you here? Go to law school, which was really interesting in hindsight. And, I say in the book, I thank God for unanswered prayers because, I would have loved to have gotten that spot at that point in my life. But had I have gotten that spot, I would have never gone to Harvard. I don't think my paths would have crossed with Trump later down the road. I don't think I would have been press secretary. So you look back and you're like, that's why that didn't work out. And I'm glad it didn't, because I would have rather stood at the podium in the Trump administration.
Yeah, it is fascinating whether it's an obstacle or a choice in your life, what that ends up leading you to. I mean, I have the same sort of questions. If I would have stayed in the Navy 20 years if I could have, and then I wouldn't be doing this, which I don't know, maybe would still be better.
but we need you in the party. You're a great congressman. We're lucky to have you.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it. All right, for anybody watching YouTube right now, yes, we just magically changed clothes and backgrounds because we got cut off on the first recording, so we're just going to pick up right where we left off. So, Kayleigh, thanks for being so flexible, first of all. But along the same vein, in these kind of press-related questions, in our time away over the last week, since last time we spoke, I was thinking about this this course I took at HKS, and it feels like we bring up Harvard a lot in this conversation. Maybe we should stop. It makes us sound like terrible people. But it was an interesting class. It was called National Security in the Press. David Sanger taught it along with Graham Allison. And it was interesting because it was this sort of inside look. And David Sanger is this big New York Times journalist. I wouldn't call him one of the woke New York Times journalists. He's responsible for a lot of these real big stories related to national security, especially. And it was an interesting class for a number of reasons. One, it was right during the election in 2016. So that was interesting enough. And Graham Allison, who's, I guess, maybe centrist, was constantly making fun of David Sanger for being a shill for Hillary Clinton, and the New York Times being a shill for Hillary Clinton, which is not something you would expect to hear at a Harvard classroom. But that's what was happening. But I just thought it was interesting, his takes on how he gets information as a journalist. And then the relationship that then occurs, like the back and forth between him and the White House, or him and the Secretary of State's press, whatever it is, it depends on the story. It was really fascinating, and this sort of give and take, and what leverage do you have? So I guess my question to you is, do you have any interesting stories like that? And how did you deal with these situations where you've got this nugget of information out there? A journalist calls you and says, "We're going to publish this. Do you have comment on it?" What leverage do you have to get them to stop or get them to change their minds? I mean, I'll just kind of let you take it from there.
Well, as a conservative, you learn that you have virtually no leverage, because they are going to run with whatever rendition of whatever faux story, fake story, phony story they want to put out there. I learned this quickly as a press person at RNC, but to a greater degree as a press person with the Trump campaign and in the Trump White House. I mean, I would have these monster New York Times and Washington Post weekend end pieces that would come in. And they basically must have spent their week aggregating sources or information from whatever disgruntled employee in the West Wing they were talking to, who had their own motives for leaking something. I always say information's currency in Washington and the swamp. And there are some great, loyal, hardworking men and women in the White House that put their head down and work on behalf of the American people. But there is another group that knew if they gave information, maybe they'd get a flattering profile in the press or a flattering mention, or they would, trade or barter information, which I thought was so unfortunate because one, it makes everyone's job harder in the White House. We're trying to focus on delivering policy goods for the American people. And then you're having to deal with this side story that for the most part is either entirely false or to a large degree false, or the context is missing. So, I, as the press secretary, one of the first New York Times pieces that came in, I spent hours aggregating the correct information. I got quotes, I got factual details, to add context to their piece. I send it all in. Virtually nothing I sent made it into the piece, like nothing, like maybe one sentence. And that's when I learned, my motto for the press shop, offense only, meant that we're not going to spend hours and hours distracted by some palace intrigue piece about what President Trump did in, an hour span of time. We'll give a quote. We'll encourage them to put it in there, but by and large, we're not going to, spin our wheels and let them determine the narrative. We'll find proactive ways to put a good story out there, like going to an honest reporter and giving them a bit of information so that they could write an honest story about an issue of importance to the American people. So we spent our time trying to work with the good journalists and with the bad ones, doing the best we could to hemorrhage or to stop the damage. But they have an agenda. They're going to run with it. That's just the fact.
Yeah, it is. And I've seen some of our newer members fall into pitfalls where they think, okay, if I can just have a beer with them, they'll get it. And it's journalists are very good at this and making friends. I've seen some really, I won't name names, but I've seen some really devastating stories on people we like, just because. And your first thought is, why on earth did you sit down with this person? There's no so many
times because I never did that. That was not the way I went. Maybe a coffee one time with a reporter, but by and large, I figured out that was useless.
So, but related to the initial question, though, what if it's like a national security issue? I mean, what if they're trying to run a story that has real consequences for our national security, maybe the declassifying of information, something along those lines? And when I speak about David Sanger, that's mostly his bailiwick, right? It was really not political. It was always, this is a secret program that you're unveiling right now, and there's consequences to that. And it's an interesting discussion between, our country's adherence to freedom of the press, but also our national security and how we think about balancing that. And did those situations come up? I mean, mostly, go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the one that comes to mind is the story that, and I think we might have talked about this in part one of our interview, but just to briefly recount that there were Russian bounties on the heads of soldiers, troops, or servicemen and women in Afghanistan, and that Trump did nothing about it. It was a devastating story. It was a false story. It's now been disproven because Biden's own U.S. intelligence community has come out and said, look, oh, wait, that was actually not, there's nothing to that. I stood at the podium and I said, this isn't verified. There's dissenting views. Don't run with something on the pages of the New York Times. They did. Now we know it was a false story. But that being said, because I do think we already mentioned this story, I would just say, I gathered statements from, I believe it was the CIA, FBI, and National Security Council, and shared them from the podium about how damaging it is to have intelligence spewed across the pages of newspapers to fulfill a left-wing narrative intent on hitting President Trump, but with devastating consequences for our intel gathering mission. And I point blank said at the podium, what ally is going to work with the United States when they know that intelligence that they give could be leaked by someone in the intelligence community and then spun whatever way fits the narrative? So it's really devastating the way intelligence was weaponized, and it certainly was in that case.
They had a habit of doing this. Adam Schiff is an expert at this, and knowing full well that we are not willing to disclose classified information, and therefore not willing to disclose our own counter arguments to whatever narrative they're spinning. I mean, they did this with the Russian collusion hoax continuously. You talk to Devin Nunes, and this was the issue really, to that made it so difficult to discredit some of these things. And the same is true for this Russian bounty case, because for some reason I was invited to the White House to look into this. I was part of like the National Security Congressman, group, and sometimes we come into the White House and we would talk about this thing. And I remember the Russian bounty one in particular, and the problem was I don't know how to talk about this in public without disclosing methods and sources.
Yeah,
and the Democrats just take advantage of that.
Yeah, they totally do. And, for me, it was a little bit easier as a press secretary. Yes, I did have a security clearance, but Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was very good at, laying out for me the parameters and what argument I could make publicly from the podium. So, I did the best I could to combat it, but you're exactly right. I think, I'm pretty sure it was mentioned in maybe one presidential brief, I think was I forget the exact facts, but I think it was written out. But again, there was no consensus on this intelligence. There were dissenting views, but I hadn't seen that presidential brief. I couldn't, fully give that information to the press because I wasn't fully read into the situation, which in some ways was very helpful because I didn't run the risk of sharing, a classified piece of information from the podium. I just had the top line point that the chief of staff and the president wanted me to share.
One of the things that Ben Rhodes always bragged about was his ability to create an echo chamber, specifically referring to the Iran nuclear deal. And it doesn't seem like something conservatives can ever accomplish. And I'm not sure how to get to a point where we can. I mean, the echo chamber by definition is multiple institutions, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, all of these, what are considered to be mainstream that have been infiltrated by an increasingly left-wing bent. We just don't have the same ecosystem on our side. I mean, I could point to a bunch of right-wing publications, but they're by no means mainstream. The echo chamber that exists in them doesn't change people's minds. And I'm wondering what our strategy should be going forward. I mean, if you were giving us your communications expertise, and this is just something I think about constantly being in politics. How do I communicate with people? How do I get them the right information? How do I get in front of them? Going on Fox News helps me to an extent, but not enough. I can't get to everybody. I am canceled by so many shows. I don't mean like cancel culture canceled. I mean, we have a booking like with CNN or Face the Nation, and they cancel. They cancel constantly on me. And people are asking me like, why don't you go on? Why don't you go on? I'm like, I am invited often. And then I think they do more research and understand my positions better. And then they're like, ooh, I don't want to deal with this guy. I think that's what happens quite often. And so it becomes difficult to reach them. And I'll frame a broad question here. Do conservatives try to do a better job infiltrating these institutions in the mainstream, or do we create our own, or is it a mix of both?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a mix of both. Look, I work at Fox. I think it's the most fair and balanced network out there. I've always thought that. I began my career at Fox, and I think it's great to have a network that truly does share both sides. There's Democrats and Republicans alike. Unfortunately, when it comes to CNN, where I also worked, there's a narrative you're never going to get around. At one point they were interested in having conservative views. I was among them. But after President Trump won, they went into full-on attack mode. And as you'll notice, they pushed out the conservative voices. So to the extent conservatives are invited on those networks, I think showing up is better than not having a voice there. But I think in terms of breaking through on messaging, look, none of us know what's going to happen on Tuesday in Virginia. I'm not sure if this is going to air before or after, but I will say this, regardless of who prevails in the gubernatorial race in Virginia, I think Glenn Youngkin has really set a model for how to communicate effectively, to identify the one issue that on a visceral level breaks through to the general populace. And he's run, I think the number one ad in the state that's run is the ad of Terry McAuliffe saying, hey, parents aren't involved in the curriculum and education. He managed to identify the one issue that gets every person animated, and he's done so effectively. So I think, going into the midterms, identifying that one issue that regardless of if you have the echo chamber of the mainstream media breaks through on such a personal level, it's capturing magic in a bottle. And, if you don't have the White House megaphone, it's hard to do. We had the White House megaphone. But absent that, I think that's your answer, is finding that issue, be it inflation, whatever it may be, that just so rings true to the everyday voter.
Yeah, and that's true. And you got to do both, right? And sometimes I think we make the mistake of of just going down the laundry list of our kind of red meat slogans and our talking points that our base loves. They love to hear it, and they get really mad, frankly, if they don't hear it. So you got to keep saying it sometimes. But we forget that there's a lot of other people that have different priorities, and connecting with them, is extremely important. What advice, again, as a communications guru, what advice would you give, let's say, new members of Congress, people kind of jumping into the fray here on how to deal with the press, what to do, what not to do? Because again, it's that balance between, I got to have my voice heard, I've got to go behind enemy lines, but it can also screw you, right? It can also be counterproductive. And what advice do you have?
Yeah, I think, and forgive me if I mentioned this previously, we taped our first half so long ago, so you can clip this out if you need to. But I think, having the right points is, of course, number one. Having the right content. I had one commentator say to me, be quotable. And I think that makes a lot of sense. If you have a way of saying something that is quotable, I think that goes a long way stylistically. Not only that, I think more than anything, it's remaining calm under fire. I mean, when you're being berated with questions, it makes the questioner look aggressive, out of touch, rude even, if you are the one who's calm under fire. As Alan Combs, one of my mentors on the left, said to me, the late Alan Combs, great man, fight fire with water, not fire with fire. And he's right. And when I learned that, to have a smile on my face as the other person is screaming me down, optically, you win the argument. I would have people across the country say to me after the 2016 election, people who watch me on CNN, man, I don't necessarily agree with everything you said, but I liked the way that you said it, and it got them to listen. And I met people who said, hey, I changed my vote based on watching you. I heard an argument against 8 other people on CNN that I didn't hear. And the only reason they heard that is because I was calm, level-headed, and academic in my approach to presenting the information. So I think that's the best thing you can do. If anything, even if you don't have your fact right, remain calm in whatever you're delivering, and always get your facts right. Have that footnote there.
Yeah, and facts that back up the point. I mean, always frame your argument. Know how you want to frame the discussion. Have a point that you want to make, and then a fact pattern to back it up. I mean, an example, it popped up across social media just a minute ago, but it was a response to the left saying that there's nobody uses guns in self-defense, right? You can't find any examples. And our response on our side was, the best answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. End of story. It's like, that's you got the point part right, but it would be really great, since it's just a social media post and you have the time to write something out, maybe give some examples. Yes, because they're not hard to find.
Yeah, exactly. And personalize it. I was talking about inflation recently, and I'm guilty of being the wonky person that loves the numbers and the percentages, which there's a place for that. But I've been trying to think, how can I personalize this issue instead of just a bunch of numbers flying past viewers? And I read this one article, forget where it was, I think it was in the New York Times, about a woman in Virginia who went to the dollar store and saw a grandmother literally watching each item being ticked off and making sure that it was not above $1, because for her, every dollar counted. And that illustration, the image of watching someone at the dollar store, as the dollar store is announcing that they're going to start charging more than $1 now, that image connects in a way that a number or a percentage doesn't. So I totally agree with you. Examples and personalizing an issue with a story can oftentimes go a long way.
Yeah, and it's hard. It takes more effort. It takes more work. It's like you have to build out a giant binder that's well tabulated.
True.
Speaking of these economic issues, I'm wondering how you deal with this. So we got about 10 minutes left. We could talk about any number of current events, but I was trying to narrow down which one would be best for us to chat about. But you talked about inflation. Let's talk about the economy. This is a supply chain crisis. There's always this debate. The Democrats like to bring up that the Trump economy was really just the end result of the good Barack Obama economy. It was just the natural trajectory of the numbers, of the unemployment numbers, of the growth, all of that. What do you say to people? Are there certain? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, and I can help you with this one too. But are there certain arguments that you like to use to sort of discredit that? And and show that these policies actually indeed work?
Yeah, I mean, there's tangible cause and effect. I mean, tax cuts put more money in the pockets of all Americans. It's why, in part, you saw wages go up for not just traditional groups where wages go up, the higher ups. You saw wages go up on the lower end of the spectrum as well. And tax cuts were a big part of that. Deregulation. All of these things are quantifiable. I know the one point, and I haven't watched this briefing in forever. It was by, I forget, the head of, it was before my tenure, but they did an economic briefing. I'd have to go back and find the date. It was about 2 years into the Trump administration. And they literally had charts that showed, under Obama, this was happening. And then you saw the V of it change under Trump. So you literally saw trend lines, which was really effective visually. I don't have the briefing. It was Kevin Hassett, I believe, that gave it. It was during Sarah Sanders' tenure. And I would always, before a hit where I knew that would be a point made, I would go back and review those charts and bring them up or see if I could even hold them up. So, I mean, I think the cause and effect is evident. Deregulation, lower taxes work. I think we're seeing, on the contrary, what's happening with this administration as we have more and more spending, more taxes down the pipeline, as they've seen with this Build Back Better government, monstrosity. As we see with this, they're just trying to tax wherever they can. There's no thought into the macroeconomic policy of what kind of tax would affect the economy in this way. It's literally just trying to raise revenue to pass something so Joe Biden can go on a victory tour and go off to Europe and tout that he got something done.
Yeah, we should talk about that for a second, maybe end with that. And the one thing I would say about the Trump economy, too, is there's one of those V-shaped changes was actually wage increases for the lowest income earners. Mm-hmm. And that's a fascinating one because everything else is stagnant, and because if you just look at a quick glance at the numbers, you can make the argument that it was just the natural trajectory. Now, I do think it's a lot harder to get from 5% unemployment to 4% unemployment than it is from 10 to 5. Okay. Because one is a bounce back from a recession, but it's not that persuasive to people. But what you can show is those lowest quintile of earners have the most rapid wage growth because they tend to benefit the most. Other really interesting numbers too on how we recovered based on the Trump economy and the pandemic of 2020, how we recovered from that and how low income earners recovered from that. They recovered very well, whereas they didn't recover at all post 2009. So there's some interesting numbers there. I think we've done podcasts about that. But back to Europe. One of the things they do is everything is related to climate change. I find this one fascinating just from a communication standpoint. People care about this issue, but they don't care as much as Democrats think they care. And plenty of studies have shown that Americans might be willing to spend maybe at the highest about $200 a year to thwart climate change. But everything they do it involves climate change. Kamala Harris's woke announcement about the national gender strategy or something, mm-hmm. or I actually suffered through it for a little bit just to see what was in it, and of course it quickly devolves into basically climate change policy. How do politically, forget about the policy, because I do plenty of podcasts on the policy of climate change and energy, but I'm curious from the communications perspective, from the political perspective, what do you think they think they're getting out of this? Do they really believe it's going to be as successful as they seem to?
No, I just think it's a religion to the left. I mean, they bow down at the altar of climate change, an issue that tends to rank among the very lowest. I agree with you that voters care, but not to the degree that they think. I also think when it's explained, one of the best speeches on this issue, I think, was President Trump's speech getting out of the Paris Climate Accord. I went back and looked at it recently, and, he said, what are we getting for this? We're cutting emissions. And I think it was something, and don't quote me on this exactly, but it was something like all of the emissions that we would cut if we adhered to the Paris Climate Accord would be wiped out by 14 days of China operating as they do. So essentially all the pain here, economic and otherwise, and China being uncooperative just wipes out all that we've done. And then he goes into the fact that in the private sector, that's where we need to have, if you want to lower emissions, private sectors where it happens. And they gave some examples of how that should work. It was really good, but I don't know what they think they're getting from it, because you're exactly right. Most voters, when they learn, okay, so I'm expected to endure onerous economic hardship, I'm supposed to believe that the Biden administration that can do absolutely nothing correct, its incompetent administration, is somehow going to make all this work. And then at the end of the day, China is going to wipe out all the gains for the economic pain I suffered. Doesn't seem like a winning playbook to me, but by all means, they can continue running with it, because I think ultimately it benefits the right.
Yeah, and I'm going to Glasgow to this climate conference. It'll be interesting. And one of the things I will certainly point out, I pointed it out today in a hearing, in the year 2020, China increased its coal capacity 3 times more than the rest of the world combined. Like, one of the deals, after that long trade war with China, one of the deals that was struck at the end was China has to buy, I think, $12 billion worth of natural gas. Now, I'm not sure if we were able to ever enforce that. I'm certainly sure that this administration has now not tried to enforce it. But that's exactly how you reduce emissions, getting them to go to our natural gas. Our natural gas burns probably a third cleaner, a third of the emissions of Chinese coal. But like you said, it's a religion, and specifically the deities of this religion are solar power and wind power. Those are the gods. Those are the gods that they worship. And of course, Gaia oversees all. It's such a bunch of nonsense. I know you got to go. Kayleigh, thanks so much for being back on and giving us your insights and your expertise. Listeners love it. So we really appreciate you and everything you've done.
Thank you. And keep up the great work, Congressman.
Thanks. Great to have you.